The avoidant has spent their entire relational life managing departures before they occur, withdrawing before being left, creating distance that prevents the vulnerability of being chosen against. They have perfected the art of leaving emotionally while remaining physically present, of ending relationships in their minds long before the other person recognizes the connection has died. The avoidant controls endings through preemptive detachment, through strategic withdrawal that keeps them perpetually one step ahead of abandonment. They have convinced themselves that this control protects them, that their emotional unavailability shields them from the pain of loss. Then someone leaves them in a way their defensive structure cannot process, cannot defend against, cannot incorporate into their familiar narratives about relationships and their own limitations. This goodbye does not arrive with the anger the avoidant expects and knows how to dismiss. It does not come with the pain the avoidant anticipates and has learned to minimize. It does not carry the desperation the avoidant is prepared to reject. Instead, this departure arrives with profound acceptance, with calm recognition of the avoidant's emotional capacity, with compassionate acknowledgement that the avoidant cannot provide what relationship requires. The person leaves not because they hate the avoidant, but because they love themselves enough to stop participating in their own depletion. They exit not with bitterness about what the avoidant withheld, but with clarity about what they deserve. They depart not hoping the avoidant will change, but accepting that the avoidant has shown exactly who they are. This goodbye shatters the avoidant because it denies them every defense they have relied upon. It forces them to witness the direct consequence of their emotional unavailability and demonstrates through its compassionate finality that someone genuinely understood them and still chose to walk away. The goodbye that accepts their emotional limitations without resentment. The avoidant has become accustomed to departures filled with resentment and recrimination. Previous partners have left with anger about the avoidant's withdrawal, with bitterness about the emotional unavailability, with accusations about the avoidant's inability to show up authentically. These angry departures, while painful, have served the avoidant's defensive needs perfectly. The anger confirmed the avoidant's belief that others want too much, that relationship demands are inherently excessive, that their withdrawal was justified response to unreasonable expectations. The resentment allowed the avoidant to position themselves as victim of others' emotional intensity rather than architect of relational emptiness. The avoidant has also learned to use others' resentment as evidence that they were right to maintain distance. When someone leaves with accusations and blame, the avoidant points to that very anger as proof that the person was unstable, demanding, or incapable of accepting the avoidant as they are. The emotional intensity of resentful departures validates the avoidant's defensive narrative that intimacy is dangerous, that vulnerability leads to attack, that keeping people at distance protects against the very explosions that occur when people finally leave. The avoidant tells themselves they were wise to remain defended when the person's exit confirms every fear the avoidant uses to justify their emotional unavailability. The acceptance also prevents the avoidant from later rewriting the departure as abandonment by someone who did not understand them. The avoidant typically tells themselves that people leave because they cannot handle the avoidant's depth, cannot appreciate their complexity, cannot accept them as they are. When someone leaves with clear acceptance of exactly who the avoidant is, this rewriting becomes impossible. The person is not leaving because they misunderstand the avoidant. They are leaving precisely because they understand the avoidant completely and recognize that understanding does not create compatibility. The goodbye's acceptance of the avoidant's limitations without resentment forces the avoidant to face that someone loved them, understood them, and still found the relationship untenable. This combination proves more devastating than anger or blame ever could. Anger suggests the person did not truly see the avoidant clearly. that emotion clouded their perception, that perhaps with calmer perspective they might have stayed. Acceptance demonstrates that the person saw the avoidant with complete clarity, and their leaving was not emotional reaction, but rational choice based on accurate assessment of the avoidant's capacity. The avoidant cannot dismiss this goodbye as overreaction or misunderstanding. They cannot tell themselves that the person was too demanding or too unstable to appreciate what the avoidant offered. They cannot reframe the departure as the person's failure rather than consequence of the avoidant's limitations. The acceptance holds up a mirror that reflects the avoidant accurately without distortion. And that reflection shows someone whose defensive structure prevents the very connection they claim to desire. The person leaving accepts this reality without resentment while simultaneously refusing to sacrifice themselves to accommodate it. The goodbye delivered without attempting to change them. The avoidant has experienced every previous relationship as battlefield where others constantly attempted to modify their defensive patterns. Partners have pleaded for more emotional availability, demanded greater vulnerability, insisted on increased presence and consistency. These attempts at changing the avoidant have formed the central conflict in every intimate relationship. The avoidant has learned to resist these efforts through various defensive strategies, claiming they are being pressured, suggesting others want too much, withdrawing further when requests for closeness increase. The constant pressure to change has reinforced the avoidant's belief that others cannot accept them as they are. The avoidant's defensive structure has organized around this expected pressure. They view relationship as inherently threatening because relationship means someone will eventually demand they dismantle their protective walls. The avoidant anticipates and prepares for others' efforts to change them, developing sophisticated defenses against requests for greater intimacy. They become experts at deflecting demands for emotional presence, at characterizing reasonable relationship expectations as excessive pressure, at positioning themselves as victims of others' inability to accept their need for distance and independence. This pattern has created self-fulfilling prophecy. Because the avoidant expects pressure to change, they interpret normal relationship progression as threatening demands. When natural intimacy deepens and partners begin wanting more consistency and vulnerability, the avoidant experiences this as attack on their autonomy rather than as organic development of deepening connection. The avoidant's resistance to this natural progression creates frustration in partners who then explicitly request the very changes the avoidant has been defending against. The cycle reinforces itself, confirming the avoidant's belief that relationships inevitably become sites of pressure and demands for transformation. The goodbye that shatters arrives completely free of any attempt to change the avoidant. The person does not suggest that the avoidant should become more emotionally available. They do not request that the avoidant work on their intimacy issues. They do not offer ultimatums about what the avoidant must change to preserve the relationship. They do not even suggest that the avoidant seek therapy or engage in self-examination. The person simply recognizes that the avoidant is who they are, accepts that this is unlikely to change, and chooses to leave based on that acceptance rather than attempting to modify what the avoidant cannot or will not alter. This absence of change attempts eliminates one of the avoidant's primary defenses. The avoidant cannot claim they are being pressured when no pressure is being applied. They cannot characterize the person as demanding when the person is demanding nothing. They cannot position themselves as a victim of others. Inability to accept them when the person is explicitly accepting them exactly as they are, while simply choosing not to remain in relationship with someone of that particular emotional capacity. The goodbye says the avoidant is free to remain exactly who they are. The person is simply no longer willing to accommodate who that is. The avoidant often responds to this absence of change attempts with confusion that gradually transforms into something more unsettling. Initially, the avoidant may feel relief that no one is demanding they transform, that they can maintain their defensive structure without resistance. Yet, as this relief fades, the avoidant must confront what the lack of change attempts actually communicates. The person has stopped investing in the avoidant's potential and has accepted that the avoidant will likely never develop the capacity for the intimacy the person needs. This represents a form of giving up that the avoidant finds more disturbing than active attempts at transformation. When someone tries to change the avoidant, they reveal continued hope and investment. The pressure to transform, while uncomfortable, confirms that the person still believes in the avoidant's potential, still sees possibility for growth, still thinks the relationship worth fighting for. The person's efforts to modify the avoidance behavior demonstrate that they have not given up on the connection, that they are willing to work toward creating a relationship that meets both people's needs. This investment, even when expressed through frustration or demands, provides the avoidant with evidence that they matter, that the relationship has value worth preserving. The goodbye delivered without change attempts contains no such evidence of investment. The person is not fighting for the relationship because they have concluded that fighting is futile. They are not requesting transformation because they have accepted that transformation will not occur. They are not expressing hope for growth because they have released that hope entirely. This absence of effort to change the avoidant communicates something the avoidant finds profoundly unsettling. The person has emotionally divested, has stopped seeing potential, has moved from hoping for a different future to accepting present reality and choosing to exit based on that acceptance. The avoidant may attempt to provoke the change attempts they unconsciously need as evidence of continued investment. They might display unusual vulnerability, hoping the person will respond by suggesting the avoidant build on this opening. They could acknowledge their limitations, expecting the person to offer solutions or encouragement toward growth. They may create situations that would normally trigger the person's efforts to improve the relationship. When these provocations meet calm acceptance rather than renewed efforts at transformation, the avoidant must face that the person has genuinely stopped investing in their potential for change. This recognition forces the avoidant to confront the cost of their defensive patterns. As long as people kept trying to change them, the avoidant could tell themselves that others simply did not accept them, that the pressure to transform was the problem rather than their own limitations. When someone accepts them completely while simultaneously leaving, the avoidant loses this defensive narrative. They must acknowledge that acceptance of their limitations does not require accommodation of those limitations. That understanding why they cannot provide intimacy does not obligate anyone to tolerate the absence of intimacy. The goodbye without change attempts also prevents the avoidant from maintaining false hope that the person will return once the avoidant demonstrates growth. When people leave while demanding change, the avoidant can sometimes win them back through temporary transformation that creates illusion of lasting growth. The person's continued investment in the avoidant's potential makes them susceptible to these demonstrations of change, even when the change proves superficial or temporary. When someone leaves without requesting any transformation, they signal that they have moved beyond believing in change possibilities. They are not waiting for the avoidant to become different. They have accepted who the avoidant is and decided that person cannot meet their needs. The avoidant faces the stark reality that someone understood their limitations completely, accepted those limitations without resentment or judgment, and still concluded that relationship with someone of such limited emotional capacity was not acceptable. The person is not leaving because they need the avoidant to be different. They are leaving because they need someone capable of intimacy, and they have accepted that the avoidant is not that someone. This acceptance without change attempts communicates finality that demands rooted in hope for transformation never could. The goodbye says the avoidant is free to remain defended, distant, and emotionally unavailable. They simply will be those things without the person who has chosen their own well-being over continued accommodation of the avoidance limitations. The goodbye that demonstrates the empath has genuinely moved on. The avoidant has relied upon a particular psychological safety net throughout their pattern of withdrawal and distancing. The assumption that the other person will remain emotionally tethered regardless of the avoidant's behavior. The avoidant has learned that they can create enormous distance, can withdraw for extended periods, can offer minimal emotional presence, and the other person will still be there when the avoidant briefly returns or decides they want connection. This reliability has allowed the avoidant to maintain their defensive structure without facing genuine consequences. The other person's consistent availability, despite the avoidant's unavailability, has served as insurance policy against the avoidant's deepest fear of abandonment. The avoidant has interpreted this pattern as confirmation of their desirability and importance. When people wait for them despite their withdrawal, when partners remain invested despite minimal reciprocation, when others continue hoping despite consistent disappointment, the avoidant takes this as evidence of their own value. The avoidant tells themselves that people cannot let them go because they are too special, too unique, too worth waiting for. This interpretation protects the avoidant from confronting that other's persistence often reflects the other's fears and attachment wounds rather than the avoidant's exceptional qualities. The goodbye that shatters arrives with unmistakable evidence that the person has genuinely moved on emotionally. This is not strategic withdrawal designed to make the avoidant miss them. This is not temporary distance meant to teach the avoidant a lesson. This is not emotional unavailability intended to trigger the avoidant's pursuit. The person has authentically released their attachment to the avoidant, has redirected their emotional energy toward their own life and well-being, has stopped organizing their internal world around the avoidant's presence or absence. The person's eyes, tone, and energy all communicate that they have departed not just physically but emotionally. This genuine moving on manifests in ways the avoidant cannot misinterpret or dismiss. The person speaks about the future without including the avoidant even implicitly. They make plans, express excitement, demonstrate investment in directions that do not involve the avoidant in any capacity. When they reference the relationship, they speak in past tense with the emotional distance one might use discussing any completed chapter of life rather than with the charge that suggests ongoing attachment. The person discusses the avoidant, if at all, with the same neutral tone they might use for any former acquaintance rather than someone who once occupied central position in their emotional world. The avoidant observes this genuine moving on and experiences destabilization that their defensive structure has no mechanism to manage. The avoidant has prepared for anger, for hurt, for desperate attempts to maintain connection. They have not prepared for someone to simply release them and redirect their emotional investment elsewhere. The avoidant's entire relational approach assumes others will remain attached regardless of the avoidant's behavior. When someone demonstrates authentic detachment, when they show through every interaction that they have genuinely let go, the avoidant confronts something their defensive patterns never anticipated: complete and irreversible emotional departure. This confrontation often triggers the avoidant's deactivating strategies initially. The avoidant tells themselves they feel relief that the person has moved on, that this releases them from any residual obligation or guilt, that they are glad the person found the strength to let go. The avoidant attempts to experience the person's emotional departure as validation of their own preference for distance and independence. Yet, beneath this defensive response, the avoidant experiences profound discomfort. The person's genuine moving on eliminates the safety net the avoidant has always relied upon. The avoidant can no longer withdraw knowing someone waits for their return. The visibility of the person's emotional freedom creates particularly acute awareness in the avoidant. The person is not hiding their moving on or pretending continued attachment to protect the avoidant's feelings. They openly demonstrate their redirected emotional energy, their investment in new possibilities, their genuine contentment with the avoidant's absence. The person laughs more freely, engages more fully with others, displays vitality that was absent during the relationship's final period. This visible flourishing without the avoidant communicates that the person's well-being improves in the avoidant's absence, that the relationship was depleting rather than nourishing them, that life without the avoidant represents freedom rather than loss. The avoidant must witness what they destroyed through their emotional unavailability. The person who once oriented their life around the avoidant, who worked tirelessly to bridge distance the avoidant created, who invested tremendous energy attempting to maintain connection despite the avoidant's withdrawal, has redirected all that care and effort toward themselves and others who can reciprocate. The avoidant sees the full measure of what was offered to them being given elsewhere or being used to nourish the person's own growth and healing. This visibility forces recognition of what the avoidant rejected through their defensive patterns. The avoidant often attempts to test whether the person's moving on is genuine or merely performance designed to provoke the avoidant's pursuit. The avoidant may reach out with messages or gestures that previously would have generated enthusiastic response. They might display vulnerability calculated to reactivate the person's caregiving impulses. They could create opportunities for interaction that would normally draw the person back into engagement. When these tests meet responses that confirm the person's genuine detachment, polite but emotionally flat acknowledgments, boundaries maintained without visible effort, complete absence of the hope or investment that once characterized the person's interactions, the avoidant must accept that the moving on is real. This acceptance forces the avoidant to confront the irreversibility of what they have lost. The person is not waiting to be won back. They are not hoping the avoidant will change. They are not organizing their emotional life around the possibility of reconciliation. They have genuinely released the avoidant and moved forward into life that no longer includes space for the avoidant's intermittent presence. The avoidant faces that their withdrawal and emotional unavailability did not simply create temporary distance, but rather destroyed something that cannot be restored, even if the avoidant were to suddenly develop capacity for intimacy they previously lacked. The goodbye that demonstrates genuine moving on also eliminates the avoidant's ability to maintain imaginary connection after the relationship ends. The avoidant typically keeps former partners in their psychological orbit through various means. Assuming the person still thinks about them, imagining the person wishes for their return, fantasizing that the person compares new partners unfavorably to them. These imaginary connections allow the avoidant to feel they maintain significance in the person's emotional world, even after withdrawal has ended the actual relationship. When the person demonstrates authentic moving on, these fantasies lose all credibility. The avoidant cannot convince themselves the person still pines for them when the person displays obvious contentment without them. The contrast between the person's state during the relationship and their state after genuine moving on reveals the cost of the avoidance patterns with brutal clarity. During the relationship, the person became anxious, depleted, confused, and disconnected from themselves through their efforts to maintain connection with someone fundamentally unavailable. After moving on, the person demonstrates peace, vitality, clarity, and reconnection with their own values and well-being. This before and after comparison forces the avoidant to recognize that their presence in someone's life, given their inability to provide genuine intimacy, creates damage rather than value. The person thrives in the avoidant's absence in ways they never could during the relationship. The avoidant faces an uncomfortable reckoning. Someone who genuinely cared for them, who understood their wounds and defensive patterns, who invested tremendous effort attempting to create connection despite the avoidance limitations, has evaluated the relationship and concluded that life without the avoidant is preferable to continued accommodation of the avoidant's emotional unavailability. This conclusion, demonstrated through visible thriving rather than simply stated, communicates that the avoidance defended position creates relationships that diminish rather than enhance others' lives. The person's genuine moving on reveals that the avoidant was not treasure worth waiting for, but rather weight worth releasing. The goodbye that releases them without punishment or guilt. The avoidant has learned to navigate relationships through careful management of guilt. They have developed sophisticated awareness of when their behavior should generate guilt and have built defenses against feeling that guilt fully. When the avoidant withdraws or disappoints, they anticipate that others will attempt to make them feel guilty through accusations, expressions of hurt, or demonstrations of how the avoidant's behavior has caused pain. The avoidant has learned to deflect this induced guilt by minimizing others' pain, suggesting others are too sensitive or withdrawing further to escape the discomfort of being made to feel responsible for others' suffering. The avoidant's relationship with guilt has created familiar dynamic where departures involve heavy doses of guilt induction. Partners leaving the avoidant typically attempt to make the avoidant understand the pain they cause, to make the avoidant feel remorse for their emotional unavailability, to ensure the avoidant experiences consequences for their withdrawal through the weight of guilt about damage they inflicted. These guilt-laden departures, while understandable given the hurt the avoidance patterns create, actually serve the avoidance defensive structure by providing familiar emotional terrain to navigate. When someone leaves while attempting to induce guilt, the avoidant can employ well-practiced defenses. They can minimize the person's pain by suggesting the person is overreacting. They can deflect responsibility by claiming they were clear about their limitations from the beginning. They can withdraw further by characterizing the guilt induction as manipulation or emotional abuse. These defensive maneuvers allow the avoidant to avoid fully confronting the impact of their patterns. The avoidant can position themselves as victim of unfair guilt, tripping rather than as person whose behavior legitimately hurt someone who cared for them. The goodbye that shatters arrives completely free of attempts to induce guilt or punish the avoidant for their limitations. The person does not detail the pain the avoidant's withdrawal caused. They do not enumerate the ways the avoidant disappointed or hurt them. They do not attempt to make the avoidant feel remorse for their emotional unavailability. The person simply recognizes that the avoidant's capacity does not match their needs and chooses to leave without making the avoidant wrong for being who they are. This absence of punishment or guilt induction eliminates the avoidant's familiar defensive responses. The avoidant cannot minimize pain that is not being expressed. They cannot deflect from accusations that are not being made. They cannot characterize as manipulation the guilt induction that is not occurring. The person's refusal to punish or guilt trip removes every defense the avoidant typically employs during departures. The avoidant faces someone who is leaving not with anger about what the avoidant did wrong, but with calm acceptance that the avoidant cannot provide what relationship requires. This compassionate release proves far more destabilizing than punishment because it prevents the avoidant from engaging their defensive mechanisms. The absence of punishment also prevents the avoidant from focusing on the person's delivery of the goodbye rather than on the goodbye's actual content. When someone leaves with anger or attempts at guilt induction, the avoidant can direct all their attention toward criticizing how the person is leaving rather than examining why the person is leaving. The avoidant focuses on the person's tone, their accusations, their attempts to make the avoidant feel guilty, and uses these elements to avoid confronting that the departure results from the avoidant's own patterns. When goodbye arrives without these elements, the avoidant has nothing to critique about the delivery and must face the substance of what is occurring. The compassionate release that avoids punishment creates particular discomfort for the avoidant because it demonstrates that the person still cares about the avoidant's well-being even while choosing to leave. The person is not attempting to hurt the avoidant or make them suffer. They are not seeking revenge for the pain the avoidance patterns caused. They are simply protecting themselves by exiting a relationship that cannot meet their needs while wishing the avoidant well despite everything. This combination of genuine care and firm boundary proves more difficult for the avoidant to process than simple anger would be. The avoidant often finds themselves wishing for punishment or guilt, because these would be easier to navigate than compassionate release. If the person were angry, the avoidant could tell themselves the person never really understood them, that the person's love was conditional, that the person was too demanding to accept the avoidant's limitations. If the person were attempting to induce guilt, the avoidant could characterize them as manipulative and use that characterization to justify their own withdrawal. The absence of anger or guilt induction eliminates these defensive narratives. The avoidant must face someone who understands them, accepts them, wishes them well, and still finds relationship with them untenable. The avoidant faces an uncomfortable truth. Someone loved them enough to leave gracefully, understood them enough to avoid punishment, and valued themselves enough to choose their own well-being over continued accommodation of the avoidant's limitations. This combination shatters the avoidant's defensive narratives about why relationships fail. The relationship is not ending because the person wanted too much, because the person could not accept the avoidant, or because the person handled difficulties poorly. The relationship is ending because the avoidant's defensive structure prevents the intimacy that healthy relationship requires. And someone finally loved themselves enough to stop sacrificing their needs to accommodate the avoidant's limitations while still treating the avoidant with compassion and respect.